Most leaders I meet feel stuck in the middle. They don't want to be controlling micromanager. At the same time, they don't want to be that nice boss either that people don't respect. And as a result, their team communication feels messy and exhausting. So in this episode, I'm joined by Ashley Hurt, author of The Manager Method and a former HR leader at McKinsey and Yum Brands. And she's going to unpack a simple 3-step framework that will allow you to earn the respect of your team without losing connection. So if you've ever wondered how to communicate so that your team both likes and respects you, this one's for you. What is oversized sweatpants leadership?
Oversized sweatpants leadership, I'd say, is often a reaction to having a different type of manager. And so oversized sweatpants leaders, I actually have them as a counter to a tight jeans manager. If you think about putting a pair of tight jeans straight out of the dryer, non-stretch, maybe you had a big meal beforehand, it doesn't tend to feel too comfortable. It feels very restrictive. And that's what a lot of managers can be, is a micromanager. And oftentimes I actually see that coming from a perspective of someone who was promoted into their role, and not just newly promoted, people that may have been in leadership for some time, but you were good at your job. And so you have this idea of often protecting your team and yourself by telling people what to do. Oh, send every email to me to review. You insert yourself really closely, constantly checking up. And I do see it's a protectionist mentality often. You don't want your team members to get embarrassed or worse. You don't want to look badly if your team's not performing. And so what I often see is people that have had that type of manager or worked with that leadership, they push into oversized sweatpants territory. Frequently is this, I'm not going to be a micromanager. And that's often the battle cry of these managers. This is what I'm not going to be. And when you say that, again, like coming from a good place, I want to be liked, you often aren't giving your team direction. And so you're trying to give them freedom, autonomy, and all of these things. But if you've ever worked for a leader like this, one that says, for example, I don't want to have one-on-ones, reach out to me if you ever need me. And I don't want to hover, I trust you. That can feel great until you go to do the work and you don't know exactly what to do, what's expected. And so it is this over-rotation of sorts of trying to give so much freedom, but your team ends up directionless.
What's the right pair of trousers we should be looking for there? What are the pants, the leadership pants we're looking for? Tight jeans, I agree. I wore them probably throughout the noughties for 10 years. It's out of fashion now. I'm not much of a sweatpants guy. So what do we do about this? Is there middle way, golden middle?
I do have a golden middle, and I like trousers since so much, better than pants. But it's really what I call cozy joggers leadership. And I caveat it that cozy doesn't mean just comfortable. It's not oversized sweatpants, which again, I don't tend to wear those, but I dropped my daughter off at the local high school and oversized sweatpants seem to be the rage. But in professional environments, cozy joggers can be the fit. And what I mean is structured autonomy. So it's this aspect of giving your teams the information they need and support, but doing that in a way that helps them know ideas of what to do and say, ideas of what they can try, freedom to try things, but knowing they have your support when you're not around. And so what that can create, whether you're a manager of individual contributors, whether you're a senior leader with a lot of levels of management, is creating this environment where people do feel comfortable trying new things. Because when you're a tight jeans manager, your teams often operate to the least common denominator. They don't want to get fired and they don't want to get embarrassed or ashamed. And so they're not going to try new things. With oversized sweatpants, your team may be trying new things, but they may be winging it. But under cozy joggers leadership, it really is giving people permission to understand, try things, being there, but you're not always there. And so thinking about that from a pair of trousers, a pair of pants can be a visual that hopefully some leaders can think about of, okay, how could I say this in a cozy joggers way? What would a decision like that look like?
Yeah, how could you say it? So what does that mean in terms of leadership communication style?
Part of it is I think of like one-on-one meetings, for example, because this is something I hear really often from new managers, but even getting to senior levels, where one-on-one meetings, like a tight jeans manager may say, okay, come, this is what the agenda is going to be. Bring me all of this information. And as a manager, that can be really important, but you may not be giving your team member opportunities to really have the meeting be for them. Oversized sweatpants managers, including up the organizational ladder, I often hear, I'm not going to have one-on-ones. That's silly. I mean, we're too senior. What am I going to have a one-on-one with my SVP? I'm a CEO. But I say by that, okay, that approach is, are people actually able to get you? Or is your phone, is your chat messages, your email, constantly getting people trying to reach out or just assuming they can't reach you? And so from cozy joggers, it's really thinking about how can I have that structured time with my team and why does that matter? But also using it actionably. Talking to your team and saying, okay, I don't want our team meetings to feel like an email. I'd like them to be practical. So how can we balance that and having an agenda people look at beforehand? And so often that's an example of really finding that balance.
Yeah, that's true. I think leadership is pretty hard these days, right? In the book Manager Method, which has just come out, you write that being a manager can be like trying to walk 4 dogs at a time. One chasing a squirrel, another's barking at the mailman, the third is lying down and refusing to move, and the fourth is trying to get you to stop and give them belly rubs immediately. And I agree. I mean, this is sometimes how leadership feels.
Yeah, I do think it's an apt analogy, and you hear it. From the work I do and the work you do, I'm sure you have people that will share with you, friends, family, people you don't even know, but they talk about this of, being a manager. I mean, people are something. And I say people will be peopling at all times. And sometimes it is a manager that you realize, oh my gosh, these people that whether they used to be my colleagues or they start and you just realize they're so vitally different. One thing about that is understanding, that can be hard, but sometimes it's having an approach to understand people's different needs, but also thinking as an organization, the ripple effects that we get by having different personalities together, that really makes an impact on results. If you have everybody that's the same or even thinks just like you, it can feel easier, but you're generally not getting the most results. And so even shifting mindsets from thinking of it is stressful or it's an obligation to work with all these different personalities is to realize that one thing as a manager is you're going to be up close and personal, and whether you are in person or whether you're remote, including working with team members around the world, you do get to know people with completely different experiences, backgrounds, ideas. And so thinking about the positive of that, I mean, that's one thing I've been surprised at is the number of leaders that say, I never really thought about the good stuff that I get to do of working with all these different personalities. I often think about how hard it is. But when I start to think of, it is good. And as I learn people's different approaches, it becomes easier over time. But how much that does benefit business results, even your own career, because you're likely going to be shaped by those people, not just the other way around.
It's super interesting. It feels to me like we're getting used to this new style of leadership because for a long time it was command and control, right? The industrial age, that was the parameter of leadership. You told people what to do and they would do it. Then it was you always have to be nice and safe spaces and empathetic at all times. And it felt like this, the oversized sweatpants that people just go and do whatever they want became entitled. And now the pendulum has swung back. And I wonder whether that is why you wrote the book and developed the method to help people to find this balance between, yes, I want to give you the freedom. I am empathetic, but work is still important. We still need to get things done. And it can't always be that work fits around your life. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, it definitely is. I mean, it really is a culmination. Like a lot of people, you think, boy, I've had the same conversation a lot, including in different environments. And so I started out as a teenager working at Subway. I was a sandwich artist at Subway. I worked at Kmart in the very...
That's what called sandwich artist.
It is a sandwich artist. I was certified, and I can still make a mean sandwich. I worked at Kmart in the electronics department, got to know a lot of the management teams there, ended up becoming a lawyer in HR. And through that, funny enough, I was outside counsel for Kmart. So I went from being a worker to a law firm lawyer for them. But I also worked for organizations like Yum Brands, KFC, and then McKinsey consulting firm. And some of those that's amazing. What are those places like dream jobs? I've seen a peek behind these. And I will say, I mean, there's some of the people you have, not just at McKinsey, but at Yum and other places, are some of the most incredible leaders altogether. But that said, I also saw plenty of people in all levels of leadership at McKinsey and every single other organization at every level of that organizational ladder. They often need real practical tips of what to do and say. And some of the things I heard are on either side of that pendulum, from things like, people's paycheck is their thanks. I'm not going to go around dropping thank yous for people. I shouldn't, unless someone does something really big. Also on the flip side of managers that would say, well, someone on my team said they needed to be out and I told them to take all the time they need, but now it's been weeks and I haven't heard from them. So what do I do? And so for managers being a conduit, I'm like, people are looking to you. I know when you don't have information, you may pass things off. And so I created Manager Method and wrote the book really to be able to have more conversations at scale that were duplicates of things I'd had my whole career of giving people tips to thread that needle in between. I say sometimes it's to drive results without driving people out the door, because I have seen that to be absolutely possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Walk us through the method, please.
So the method is 3 words: pause, consider, act. The first pause, it's actually the one that I see people not do the most, including people at all levels of leadership. What I mean by pause is not stop. It doesn't mean do nothing, because I know action matters in the workplace. There's a reason that ACT is ending up this very extensive formula. But pause is often, especially as leaders, you think that you need to have all the answers or you have an immediate reaction. We often go through life including at work, by making decisions and not pausing to take that second step, which is to consider. So people say, okay, if I pause, was that just an awkward in a conversation? But when people pause is to really consider the person on the other side of that, or what's the outcome you're looking for. Oftentimes I say, think about yourself. If you were in that person's shoes, what would you want to have happen? Or think of a loved one. So back there in the video recording, under my thumb was my grandmother, Gigi, who lived 96 wonderful years. And I said, she would not be perfect. She may make mistakes at work. If Gigi made a mistake, or if I made a mistake, I have it, certainly. I generally would like a leader to come to me with questions. Sometimes the answer is going to be, I messed up, and I've got to take accountability for that. But what happens all too often is when the process of making a mistake, you may have even on tons of organizations' values. It'll say, mistakes are a learning experience or something to that effect. But then when it happens, people are actually terrified. They have a pit in their stomach to share it. When they tell it to the manager, there's just so much frustration. And it's not actually looked at as a learning experience. And so even considering in those times, what would I want to have happen if it were me or if it were a loved one? To your point of the over-rotating oversized sweatpants, that doesn't mean not having conversations or giving someone critical feedback because it feels mean. It's thinking about how you do it in a way that builds people up and doesn't break them down. And so that's the third step, is act. So I really see people, especially in leadership, missing the two aspects of that, the pause and then the act. One is sometimes people will say in leadership, okay, let me get back to you on that. And there's a lot of people waiting for you to get back to them, and you don't. And so when that doesn't happen, other people assume, well, that was a terrible idea, or they must think I'm an idiot. They fill that silence with the worst case scenario. You may have just forgotten because you're actually very human. And so making sure that you're following up on the things that you've said you've done, or you're doing the things that you've held yourself back from. Having conversations that you really don't want to have. Having conversations that you say, why do I have to have this? This person's manager 4 managers ago should have had this. And so just this 3-step formula really is a way to think about any situation as a people leader. And I give examples across different industries of that in the book.
Yeah, do you have a story you can share of someone who does it really well? So I love the simplicity. Pause, consider, act. Pause, of course, because we want to respond and not just react. Considering, thinking about the response, always good. But then also acting, and that can be a commitment to help someone, commitment to invest in someone's, skill development capabilities, but also maybe to act differently next time, right? To learn from my experience and what reaction did I get, through the actions I've displayed here in this particular situation. I always come back to this, that leadership has become pretty complex, right? When you think about our parents, or you mentioned grandparents, grandmothers, generations, one workplace, one language, one time zone, one culture, no email, no digital communications. The work didn't really change that much, even over years or decades. And now we're in this super high-powered, very fast-moving environment where people deal with different time zones, cultures, generational differences, very pronounced, etc., etc. It's just so complex now that leadership has to be made more simple. Otherwise, we're just drowning in the complexity that we see and the overwhelm. So I really appreciate the pause, consider, act. And maybe you can hammer it home with, a nice story by someone who does it well.
You mentioned time zones, so I'll jump on that. Actually, it was a colleague who was senior to me, very much more senior to me at McKinsey. We were talking about things, and we'd have to get on calls periodically. And when the person wrote me, they would suggest a time, say, okay, how about 2 p.m.? But they'd say 2 p.m. Atlanta time. That person was not located in Atlanta. They were located across the world. But I was located in Atlanta. And when they wrote that, it conveyed so much. And I noticed that. What that simple phrasing said was, I respect you, I respect your time. But they also had to pause and think about that. And so I had been on a conversation once, and I thought, I meant to tell you, I really appreciate when you send emails, just how you think, oh, I'm in Atlanta time, because I live here and you're otherwise. And she's like, yeah, sometimes I'll go on, Google or whatever and make sure it's the same time zone, because I'm not always, sometimes there's differences and things like that. And I laughed. But she's like, somebody had done that to me once, and it really meant a lot.
Mm.
A seemingly simple thing like that, but can go on, because if you think of the flip of it, people don't tend to pause, they act. They just don't tend to pause and consider. When you're sending a message to somebody across the world, if you're sending it to 6 different people, by no means am I suggesting anyone needs to say London time and Atlanta time. You don't need to be the news, but this will date me, but the example of the news clocks, behind you don't need to be an expert on world time. That is, the internet does help us with that. Especially if you're writing with one person, when you do that and send that to someone, because I think a lot of us have had times when someone is in another time zone and they write it just for themselves. That's fine. I mean, it's up to me to figure that out. But when you show that level of care, it really sends a lot about what you're going to be like to work with and the care that you have for someone. And so that Atlanta time, as an example of pause, consider, act, to me, that meant a lot. And it's something that I now try to carry on anytime I'm reaching out to someone.
Yeah. I love that. I love that example, and I obviously think a lot about time zones, and I deal with it every day, right? So you can always, I had to look up, is Atlanta the same as New York time zone?
Yeah.
So, okay, so, learn something there. You also write that confidence as a manager is to stop thinking about yourself. Please explain.
Well, it's even going back to the first talking about tight jeans managers.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm a realist, and I've had times when I was newly promoted to management. I've had times when I've taken on larger teams. And I know that as humans, there's a lot that we're afraid of. Again, whether it's things like job loss. In the US, we tend to have even more skewed power dynamics than I think a lot of places in the rest of the world have as far as like what work means and your identity at work. But I do think oftentimes we think about ourselves. And so you worry about that. Okay, I need to delegate, but I can do this so much better than anybody else can. I can do it faster than anybody else can. I don't want to overload their plate. I feel guilty. If I do this, I'm not going to look as necessary. A lot of this, I think, is recognizing that as a manager, as a leader, your team's success, again, whether that's individual contributors or whether you're looking at multiple levels of management underneath you, quote unquote, on the org chart, their success is really what to focus on. And if you take yourself out of it, then everything from delegation. Like, okay, you're right. It is important to delegate. It's important to think realistically about who to delegate to. Are you just giving things to the same people? Is this a time-sensitive, critical thing? Like, that actually is probably going to be very stressful for you and them and everybody else. Like, that might not be right. And so there are things to consider. But when you take yourself out of it or discomfort for yourself, as both a lawyer and HR, I saw the worst of the worst situations. And sometimes it was someone doing something just awful at work. That person shouldn't work around anyone, let alone manage anyone. But often what I saw was silence. Two things of people, managers saying, I don't want to give critical feedback. It just feels so mean. And so I don't know how to have it. So I'm not going to have that conversation. That was pretty much the most common pattern I saw from people holding back from needed critical feedback. And the flip of it was on things like recognition, recognizing people say, but I'm busy. I'm just trying to get through. I just forgot. And now it's awkward. Someone did it 2 weeks ago. That feels awkward. I say in both of those situations, take yourself out of it for a second or put yourself in their shoes. If you weren't doing a good job, how would you feel if you knew your manager had feedback to tell you, but wasn't because they didn't want to hurt your feelings?
Yeah, it's true. Then the answer is pretty obvious, right? Oh, I'd rather know, because it's not going to get any better.
It's about how they tell it. My feelings won't be hurt if they can do things that avoid hurting my feelings.
Are you sick and tired of spending 8 hours preparing for a 1-hour presentation? You're not alone. That's why I created my tactical guide, 50 presentation hacks. It's for free. Grab it in the show notes.
What I've noticed often is then a question about delegations, like, the leader thinks he or she didn't do a great job with this, and the person delegated, the team member thinks, well, the way he delegated was unclear, right? So is there a right way, or there's some secrets that you can share with us concerning delegation? What's the best way to delegate?
I definitely have talk about it in the book, but one of them in particular is think about the word accountability. Mm-hmm. And is it a bad word? If I were going to say a word like accountability, much like feedback, spoiling it a little bit, but if I were to say that to a group of people, most of them would think, oh, that's a bad term. Accountability means you're in trouble. But accountability, especially with something like delegation, the trap that sometimes people fall into is, again, not delegating, but we talked about that, and you're listening here on the podcast, so we're going to delegate, including if you're senior. The idea of delegation, what do people need to know? Oftentimes it's, okay, here's this needs to be done by next Thursday. You kind of delegate those basic things. But one conversation I think more people can have is, what's your plan? Like sometimes someone will say, here's 5 examples of how to do it. And I do think that could be helpful for people to give something to start with. But oftentimes people, especially if they're uncertain, they'll just copy what's been done and move on. Or they say, yeah, I can do that. But there's not a conversation about everything else on their plate. So sometimes that delegation conversation, you've listened to the podcast, you've read the book, you've done this and given opportunities. Well, if you don't have a conversation with someone to explain why you picked them, and then also talked about things like what else is on your plate, then people sometimes walk away from that actually resentful. It does the opposite. Someone thinks, okay, well, my leader knows everything I have going on. So now they just want me to work more. So they're just trying to shove things off on me. And so all of that can be cleared up generally with communication. So explaining. Sometimes they won't be able to get it done, and it's better to know that during that initial conversation for you to get to the deadline and it's either not done or not done well. But having that conversation and sometimes asking someone like, what else do you have on your plate? I know, especially from very scientific studies I do on social media by posting videos every day, is comments people will get is, well, if my manager asks me what I'm doing, then my manager shouldn't have a job. And that's how a lot of people really feel. And so sometimes it's again explaining to say, I obviously know generally what you're working on, but I'm not a wizard and I don't want to assume everything. So let's talk through it and how to prioritize. There are people that go their whole career without having someone that just has that basic conversation. And so some of those steps to make sure you prioritize, explain why you're asking, and then saying, okay, if it's Monday, we need it by next Friday. And that's more important than just saying, this isn't urgent, or giving people specifics is welcome.
Yeah.
But to say, where do you think you should be by Wednesday and what are you going to do to put that into action?
Nice. Sharing the intent behind the ask is very important, right? Because that's sometimes what's missing. The big picture, why are we doing this? What are we trying to achieve here? And why am I asking you rather than Susan, right? So that is, I think, sharing the intent is so crucial. The other way I think about delegation is that you can obviously delegate a task, right? Hey, you get this report done by Friday, and you can delegate a process to say, the leadership team should have these numbers every Friday. So you're delegating a process, but you can also delegate an outcome. The leadership team should be aware of relevant sales data. So create the process, put it into place and execute it, which is much more empowering, I think.
Yeah, I love that example because getting people in the conversation. I mean, one thing I think leaders struggle with sometimes is, okay, how am I supposed to get work done, develop my team? There's a lot of ways that you can do both at once because think about how many decisions that you're making. I mean, many leaders in that situation would say, okay, we got to get everybody else this sales data, this is what we need. And they think, okay, assigning somebody else to that task will get it done. But if you stop and do exactly what you suggested and say, okay, this is the outcome. What are the ways we can do that? And think about, is that a team meeting? Is that one-on-one conversations? What is the right approach here? Getting ideas. I mean, often there's decisions that you're making and bringing people into them. Again, sometimes it's broader. Sometimes you have time constraints. But a development opportunity by having that back and forth, you tend to give people a peek that you probably wish you had, especially for leaders that had no idea what being a manager or senior leader was like until you stepped into the role. You're giving a peek into that. And you generally will end up with better outcomes. Again, even if you don't adopt that person's idea, you're getting them thinking and you're stretching them out and you're doing that for yourself as well to really incorporate more people's consideration.
Yeah. What gets tricky is often when, there may be some pushback, say, I'm already busy, etc. My child's sick, and relevant points that can be brought forward, but still the work needs to get done. How do you think about this? Yes, empathy, but I can't be a pushover. Otherwise, I'm going to do all the work myself as a leader. How do you think about this tension that leadership inherently brings these days where command and control is no longer an option?
What I see is the conversation in that moment. Okay, we have work that needs to get done. My team member's sick or other things. Someone suffered a loss, really, really tough things. And you do blend into, okay, I want to support this person. But as a leader, and I say this in the book, that more people than not would like to admit it, do think to themselves, how am I going to get things done? And I think that really is an important aspect of leadership. You feel these pressures and people feel guilty about that, but knowing that's a very real reaction. And so one thing I recommend is as a leader, before you're in that experience, or again, if you've been leading the team to do this now, to bring it up to your team and say, okay, as we work on this, if someone needs to be out unexpectedly, how would we cover that? And I say, big caveat, don't say if someone's child was sick suddenly. Don't, wish, you don't need to give specifics on that. I generally intentionally say out unexpectedly because that can be truly all sorts of things. But that can help tremendously to get people thinking about what I would do. What would you do? And not only can that help in those moments, but it also can help in things like time off. In the book, I talk about the very real importance of time off for your team members and for yourself as a leader. I constantly see, maybe more so in the US than others, but I think even globally, as you get into leadership, people say, well, I can't take time off, I'm a leader. Well, if they see, okay, well, it may come with a pay raise and things like that, but it also means sacrifices to my life. And for yourself, not only can it have real impacts on your health if you're not taking time to recharge, but even your performance. When you have conversations and frame out that outcome of, okay, if you need to be off, what can we do to make sure that work is not adding more stress on top of an already stressful situation? Or what would that look like to be able to take a vacation and not check your email? And so having those outcomes in mind and then backing into it and saying, okay, sometimes there may be exceptions, like, okay, here's my number, so people might call me for something, but really trying to drive towards those outcomes in doing it as a team and doing it before you actually have to, that can make it a lot easier when the need arises.
It's a really good perspective shift, because often these short-term pressures come from not doing the sort of the homework, the long-term thinking to put systems in place. Also removing things, right? Often there's just too many emails and too many meetings that don't add a lot of value, that take up the day, so that people then have to, quotation marks, real work in the evenings and on the weekend. And for me, that's always like, hang on. What about all these meetings? Do we really need all these meetings? My approach is always to help them to increase the quality of the communication, so the quantity can be decreased, which already helps taking up meetings, reducing the number of Slack messages, and so forth.
Agreed.
One reason why leaders feel so driven can be imposter syndrome, that they feel, I really have to earn my keep. I may not belong here, or these other people are so much smarter, better educated, or I've been promoted, too early, whatever it may be, right? There's this nagging feeling that, I may not be enough for this role. What do you tell these people?
Well, I take some words from the two individuals that coined the term imposter syndrome. Dr. Suzanne Imes and Dr. Pauline Clance actually both did their research at Georgia State in Atlanta, where I live. And they actually have said, well, we don't like that term. We prefer the term imposter phenomenon. And the difference from syndrome to phenomenon, they say, that I say this to leaders is, you're not sick. It's not like something's overcome you. There's nothing wrong with you. Phenomena, it appears. And sometimes it appears and goes away. Sometimes it stays. Sometimes it increases the bigger your title gets, because you feel like everything from your livelihood to your reputation to the stakes just being so much higher. And so one thing I think is really helpful is to talk about it. In the book, I talk a lot, not just about managing your team, but building relationships cross-functionally, having conversations with your own leader. If I were just to close my eyes and think about some of the most memorable times at work, I'm not going to remember the specifics of the tasks or the processes or things like that. But I do remember people like Greg Creed, who is the CEO of Yum Brands. He has read the book, had some nice things to say about it. I appreciate that. But what I loved about Greg Creed is, so he's CEO of a huge multi-billion publicly traded company. I would see him in our corporate cafeteria. We had sessions where he would talk about, we had one about mistakes, for example, and he talked about mistakes that he had made. And it was so enlightening because, every day we have this fear often that we bring. I'm going to look silly. I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to lose everything. When you see leaders, including at the very top levels of organizations, talk about what they did, how they learned from it, and how they still ended up in very successful positions because of it, to me, and what I've seen and in the research is having conversations. So whether that's with others at work, whether that's with people in your network, with friends. I've recently seen some posts that talk about with your friends, talking about what you do and the pressures that you face. I have a group chat with my 4 best girlfriends from law school. That group has saved each of us from imposter syndrome at different times, because it provides validation, humor, all aspects of things. And so, and those aren't people I see day to day, but however you can formulate that, sometimes that's with former colleagues, but I do think talking about it is one of the best ways to open it up, because I've hardly met people that don't feel this at all. And candidly, the most successful leaders will talk about how they felt this way. And, they'll kind of, you see them ease from a tight jeans mindset into the realities of what it's like. And it really is humanizing and can even motivate you when you really need it.
Yeah, no, I love that. Encouraging people to talk about it and having peer group where you can talk about it honestly. I don't suffer from it now, but when I started out, I come from a small town in Germany. I went to an elite university in London. So, there's this, the language and all these smart, rich people. And, it wasn't easy, but I always remember this German saying that everyone cooks with water, right? Because at the end of the day, we're all humans. We're just, trying to get through and trying to make the most of it. And I always say, well, I do my best and that's all I can do. And as long as I do my best and bring my best game and do as much as I can, as well as I can, everything will be fine. So, that puts me at ease. And fortunately that, as I'm no longer that age group, you kind of grow out of it as well a little bit. I feel that, at some point you just accept, there must be something to it, what I do. So otherwise people wouldn't respond to it. So, can't be too bad. And generally speaking, it's getting out of your own head, right? Coming from a position of service, of giving, not getting. And if it's just me giving and some people find it useful and helpful, great. So that can't be wrong in itself. So that's how I deal with it. But I learn a lot of people and do work with a lot of people, very senior people who have this nagging voice in their heads, and sometimes for years or even decades. So it is real. And I think it's good that we openly talk about it.
I definitely agree. And I think, I've heard from some senior leaders. One, I went to a luncheon with, it was a talk about, how I got to this place in my career. And I won't say the person's job, but it was a senior role. It was not a CEO role, but it was a C-suite role in a different function for a very well-known organization. But the way they talked about it was, well, this is my role, but my brother is a CEO of an even more well-known organization. And we can always look to things. I have a podcast called HR Besties with two other people from social media. They both have multiple times more followers than I do. And so I say, even people I know,
you have 500,000, just to put this out.
I know, they have they have I think 2 million and 3 million collectively. So at any point I could look and say, I follower numbers. But I long ago had to ignore the analytics of social media, or how many followers do you have, how many likes. No matter how many you get, it's never going to serve you. I prefer much more when I get a comment from saying I learned leadership tips from you. And again, sometimes that's an aspiring manager or a student. I've gotten to know CEOs that I did not realize how many CEOs look at TikTok. And so I really do know that looking around, you can always find opportunities to think less of yourself. But so sometimes having those reminders of people that really see the good in you. The last thing I'll say before we move on is this morning, I got a message from one of my friends I went to middle and high school with, grew up in Louisville, Kentucky. She sent a message out of the blue. I've known her, we keep up on social media, but I haven't talked to her in over a decade. And she wrote this note that literally said, "I'm so proud of you. I have to stop myself from engaging with every one of your posts because I think people would think I'm some company to support you. But I just wanted to message and tell you that I am so proud of you and what you're doing." And obviously that made my day and then some, but anybody can do that to other people. And I will say, if anyone's listening to the podcast, and okay, well, that would be weird. If I reached out to someone, they would think my family's being held for hostage because I'm not the type to send that message. But if you're going to say, I was listening to the Speak Like a CEO podcast, and they said, think about somebody at any point in your life, someone you know now or have known long ago, and something they did that meant something to you, and send them a message and say, I had to think about that person. Again, pause, consider, act. That person hears it. They will not think it's cheapened because there's a reason that you thought of them. They will think of all the people you know, you thought to send it to me. That can make such a difference. And so that's one ripple effect that hopefully, aside from all the other tips we've talked about, that you can take away and make a ripple effect for somebody else.
I love that. So, go on WhatsApp, send someone a nice message, someone who's impacting you, someone you're thinking about. It's, it takes 10 seconds, but it can make someone stay, and, the karma always comes back. Actually, so good. The book is called Manager Method. Your podcast is called HR Besties. Where can people find out more about you, keep up to date with what you're doing?
You can go to managermethod.com. You can find my social media and all the links there. If you do go to managermethod.com/book, you can find the places to get my book, but also get a free reflection guide if you're reading the book on your own, or a book club guide if you're reading it with a group. And I do have it in hard copy, digital, and audiobook. I recorded the book in studio. So
amazing. This is almost my final question. What's your best piece of communications advice?
I really do think pausing to tell people a little bit more information. If Oliver, if you're my boss and you're reaching out to me to set up a meeting and it's Friday and you're setting it for Monday at 9 a.m., writing the context of that meeting. Because if there's no context, I'm going to assume I'm getting fired on Monday morning. And so adding that piece of context can do a world of difference. But other times, things like when you're hiring someone or when you're delegating a project, tell that person why. So when you're hiring, well, this is what stood out from you in the hiring process, or delegating. This is something I saw in you that made me think about this opportunity. When you do that, you're providing context, and you're also massively increasing the care that person's going to bring to their work or any specific task or process.
This is so important, right? We often jump to content of the message, but context comes before content. Thank you. As we heard, Manager Method, get the book. It's awesome. And thank you, Ashley. I appreciate everything you do. This comes from the right place. And I love how you're showing us there's a middle path between, being a softie and the big sweatpants that don't suit anyone and the tight jeans that have been out of fashion for a long time. I really appreciate you and all the work you're doing.
Thank you very much. You too.
Thanks for watching. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Speak Like a CEO channel. It means the world to me and it helps us keep bringing you world-class insights and guests.